I think we should keep this simple, my older brother said, before the attorney had even finished unfolding the document. There's no reason to drag this out. I hadn't said anything yet. I hadn't even had time to process what we were sitting there for, what it meant to hear my father's decisions read out loud in a room that still smelled faintly like polished wood and stale coffee. But somehow, I was already being positioned as the problem. I'm not dragging anything out, I said, keeping my voice steady. I just want to understand what's being read. He didn't look at me when he replied. It's all straightforward. That was the first moment something in me tightened, not because of what he said, but because of how quickly he said it. Like the outcome had already been decided somewhere else, and this was just a formality. The attorney cleared his throat and continued. The house, the primary account, the investment portfolio, all of it was assigned to my brother. Not shared, not divided. Assigned. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, waiting for the part where things balanced out. Something that acknowledged the years I'd spent handling doctor appointments, managing bills, making sure our father didn't forget his medications or miss a payment. That part didn't come. Instead, when my name finally appeared, it was followed by a clause, a smaller financial portion. Conditional. To be distributed provided that she remains cooperative with the administration of the estate and does not obstruct its execution. I remember blinking at the paper, even though I couldn't actually see it from where I was sitting. Cooperative. The word sat there like it had always belonged in that sentence. This doesn't sound like him, I said quietly. For the first time, my brother looked at me. It's exactly like him, he said. He wanted things handled efficiently. The attorney didn't interrupt. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He just kept reading. But something about that word, cooperative, didn't fit. My father avoided conflict. He didn't write conditions like that. He didn't frame relationships in terms of compliance. At least, not in any way he'd ever said out loud. The reading ended faster than I expected. Papers were gathered, chairs shifted. It all had the feeling of something already concluded. My brother stood first. I'll take care of the next steps, he said, already turning toward the attorney. We don't need to overcomplicate this. He still wasn't asking. I stayed seated for a second longer, letting the room settle around me. I was trying to match what I'd just heard with the person I thought I knew. It didn't line up. But I didn't say that again, because I'd spent most of my life not saying things when they didn't line up. I've always been the middle one. Not the one people look to first, and not the one people worry about the most. Just somewhere in between. Reliable, available, easy to depend on. When our father's health started slipping, it was me who adjusted my schedule. Me who took the calls. Me who learned how to read his insurance statements and kept track of which medications needed refilling. None of it was dramatic. It was just what needed to be done. And I did it without asking where it placed me. My brother handled the bigger decisions. That's how it had always been framed. He was the one who spoke with authority, who translated things for the rest of us. If our father said something vague, my brother would restate it more clearly, and that version became the one everyone followed. At some point, I stopped questioning that. It felt easier to keep things running than to challenge the way they were set up. So sitting there, hearing that word, cooperative, I did what I had always done. I let it pass. We stepped out into the hallway together. My younger sister was already checking her phone, like she needed something to anchor herself to that wasn't this. Well, she said lightly, without looking up, At least it's all clear." It wasn't clear, but she didn't wait for a response. My brother was already talking to the attorney about timelines, probate, transfers, words that sounded efficient and distant, like they belonged to a system, not a family. "I'll coordinate everything," he said. "No need to involve everyone in every detail." There it was again, that quiet narrowing of space. I stood there for a moment, then said, "I'd like to be included in the decisions." He gave a small smile. Not dismissive exactly, just controlled. "Of course," he said. "You'll be informed." Informed, not included. I nodded anyway, because correcting him in that moment would have turned into something else, something bigger, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Emails started coming through, mostly between my brother and the attorney. I was copied on some of them, not all. Updates, summaries, next steps. It all sounded organized, clean. But I noticed a pattern almost immediately. Decisions were already made by the time I saw them. The language was always the same. "We've decided. We're moving forward with. This has been handled." There was never a question attached. At first, I told myself it didn't matter, that this was just logistics, that not every step required input. But then there were meetings I wasn't invited to, conversations that had clearly happened without me. I found out about them afterward, in brief mentions that assumed I already knew. "I thought we agreed on that," my brother said once when I asked about a property-related detail. "No," I said. "I wasn't part of that conversation." He paused, just slightly. "Well," he said, "it was a small thing." It wasn't a small thing. It was a decision about how part of the estate would be managed going forward. But the way he said it made it sound like it was. Like my absence from the decision was the natural state of things. A few days later, he asked me to come by his place to go over some paperwork. I almost didn't go. Something in me was already starting to pull back. But I did, because that's what I'd always done. His kitchen table was covered in neatly stacked documents, tabs, labels, everything organized in a way that looked efficient from the outside. "These are just standard forms," he said, sliding a set toward me. "Nothing complicated." I picked up the top page. It was dense, filled with language that required more than a quick glance. "What is this for?" I asked. "It's just to streamline the process," he said, "so we can move forward without delays." That didn't answer the question. "I'd like to understand it before I sign anything," I said. He leaned back slightly, like he hadn't expected resistance. "It's routine," he repeated. "The attorney already reviewed it." I looked down at the page again. My name was there, a signature line waiting at the bottom. And suddenly, that word came back. Cooperative. I set the paper down. "I'll take it with me and look it over," I said. His expression shifted, just enough to notice. "That's not really necessary," he said. "We're trying to keep things moving." "I understand," I said, "but I still want to read it." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Fine," he said finally. "Just don't sit on it too long." I nodded, gathered the papers, and left. Driving home, I kept thinking about how easily that moment could have gone differently. If I had signed without asking. If I had done what I'd always done. Let someone else define what was necessary. That night, I spread the documents out on my own table, slower, without someone watching me. Some of it was, in fact, routine. But not all of it. There were sections that shifted authority. Subtle, but clear if you read closely. language that gave my brother discretion in certain decisions without requiring my input. Nothing overt, nothing that would stand out unless you were looking for it. But it was there, and it lined up too neatly with everything else that had been happening. The meetings I wasn't part of, the decisions already made, the assumption that I would agree. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. It wasn't just the documents, it was the pattern. And the more I looked at it, the harder it was to ignore. A memory surfaced then, not dramatic, just a small, quiet moment from a few weeks before my father passed. He had been sitting at the table, going through a stack of papers, slower than usual, more deliberate. "What are you working on?" I had asked. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said. There had been something else in his tone, something I hadn't pressed on at the time. "Do you want me to look at anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I just need to understand it myself first." At the time, I thought that was the end of it. Now, sitting there with those documents in front of me, it didn't feel like the end of anything. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't fully seen. The next morning, I checked my email. Another update had come through. "We've finalized the approach for the property management," my brother had written. "Everything is in place." Everything. I stared at the screen for a long second. Then I closed it. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure I believed that. Not in the way he meant it. There was something missing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been there once. I didn't answer my brother's email right away. That was unusual for me. For years, I had been the one who replied quickly, confirmed details, filled in gaps, made sure nothing stalled because of me. Even when I disagreed with how something was being handled, I usually responded in a way that kept everything moving. This time, I let the message sit. Not to make a point, not to start a fight. I just couldn't bring myself to step back into the same rhythm when something in me had already started pushing against it. By noon, my phone rang. It was my younger sister. "Hey," she said, in that careful tone people use when they're pretending a conversation is casual. "Did you see Daniel's email?" "I saw it." There was a pause. "He said you hadn't signed the forms yet." "Because I'm still reading them." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Are they a problem?" I looked out the kitchen window while she said it. The neighbor across the street was dragging a trash bin to the curb, and for a second I focused on that instead of answering. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm not signing something I don't understand." "Okay," she said quickly. "I mean, that makes sense. I just think everyone's already stressed, and maybe this isn't the time to slow things down." There it was again. The same idea in softer language. Not "what do you need?" Not "what are you seeing?" Just don't disrupt the flow. "I'm not trying to slow anything down," I said. "I'm trying to understand what I'm being asked to agree to." "Right," she said. "I know. I'm just saying Daniel's handling most of it, and he probably doesn't want things to get complicated." Complicated. Another word that sounded neutral until you realized who it was always describing. I kept my voice even. "Do you know what's in the forms?" "No," she admitted. "Not exactly." "Then why are you calling?" She exhaled softly. "Because he asked me to." I closed my eyes for a second. Of course he did. Not because she had strong feelings about the paperwork, not because she wanted to understand it either, but because she had always been the easiest bridge to cross when he wanted a message delivered without sounding controlling. "I'm not refusing," I said. "I just need more time." "Okay," she said again, quieter now. "I'll tell him." After we hung up, I sat there with my phone in my hand, feeling the same heaviness I'd been carrying since the will reading. But it had changed shape. At first, it was shock, then confusion. Now it was becoming something more focused. Not anger, exactly. Recognition. I spent the rest of that afternoon reading the documents line by line. I marked sections with sticky notes, looked up terms I wasn't familiar with, compared one page to another. Once I slowed down enough to stop taking the language at face value, the pattern became impossible to miss. There were multiple places where administrative efficiency translated into my brother having sole discretion. Decisions about maintenance on the property, temporary authority over distributions, the ability to approve expenses without joint review under certain thresholds. Each clause on its own looked manageable, technical, almost boring. Together, they created a structure where my involvement existed mostly on paper. By evening, I had circled so much that the pages looked bruised. I kept thinking about the will itself, about the wording, about the way the attorney had read that line without emphasis, like he was trying not to give the room any more emotion than it already had. And I kept returning to the same thought. This doesn't sound like him. Not because my father had been generous in some sweeping, cinematic way. He hadn't. He was practical to a fault, careful with money, slow to make changes. But he also wasn't legalistic in his personal life. He didn't talk about people as if they were liabilities to manage. He didn't use cooperation as a measure of love. At least, not with me. The next morning, I called the attorney's office. His assistant answered first. Professional, warm, practiced. I was hoping to ask Mr. Whitaker a few questions about the estate documents, I said. Of course, she said. Is this urgent? I almost said no. That was my instinct, always to minimize, always to make myself easy to fit into whatever schedule or structure was already in place. But then I looked at the stack of papers still open on my table. Yes, I said. I think it is. She put me on hold. A minute later, his voice came through. Ms. Harper. No one in my family called me that. Hearing my last name in his voice made everything feel more official than I was ready for. Thank you for taking the call, I said. I had some questions about the forms my brother asked me to sign. Of course. I asked about one clause first, then another. He answered carefully, not evasively exactly, but with the restraint of someone who had learned how to say only what he could stand behind later. When I asked whether these forms were required immediately, he said, not necessarily immediately, no. That alone mattered. My brother had presented them as if delay itself would create a problem. I turned a page. There's language here that seems to give Daniel authority to act without consulting the rest of us. Is that standard? In some estate structures, temporary discretion can be common, he said. In ours? A brief pause. In yours, he said. It was proposed as part of the administrative process. Proposed, not required. I wrote the word down. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I asked the question that had been sitting just underneath everything else. Did my father make any changes close to the end? There was a silence on the line that felt different from the others. Not confusion, not annoyance. Something more deliberate. He did review several things in the months before his death, Mr. Whitaker said. I sat up straighter without realizing it. Several things? Yes. What does that mean? It means he had follow-up appointments, questions, clarifications. His tone stayed measured, but I could hear the edges of caution now. Did he sign anything else? I asked. Another pause. I think, he said, that would be better discussed in person. The room went completely still around me. Not because he had answered the question, he hadn't, but because he hadn't dismissed it either. Before that moment, my suspicion had still been mostly instinct, something off in the wording, in the pacing, in the way my brother kept trying to move things forward without giving me room to think. Now it had weight. I scheduled an appointment for the next afternoon. When I hung up, I stared at the notes I'd taken. My handwriting had grown smaller halfway through the call, tighter and more compressed. Like even my body had understood before my mind did that something important was being contained. For the rest of that day, I did something I probably should have done earlier. I started remembering on purpose. Not just the broad shape of my father's final months, but the details, the calls he had asked me to make, the envelopes on the table, the way he had become more private in some ways and more dependent in others. My father never liked needing help. Even when he clearly did, he preferred to frame requests as temporary. A ride, not ongoing support. A question, not confusion. A favor, not dependence. I had adjusted to that without thinking much about it. I learned how to offer help in ways that let him keep his pride. I'd stop by because I was nearby, even when I wasn't. I'd bring groceries without asking if he needed them. I'd sit with him while he sorted bills so it felt like company, not supervision. Daniel rarely saw that side of him. Or if he did, he didn't seem to register it. My brother interacted with our father through decisions, appointments to be made, repairs to approve, accounts to review, useful things, important things, but not the quieter parts. And still, Daniel had always spoken with certainty, as if competence naturally gave him ownership. Maybe that was part of why everyone deferred to him. He never sounded unsure. He said things in a tone that made questions feel inefficient. I had spent years mistaking that for strength. The next afternoon, I drove to Mr. Whitaker's office with the radio off. I didn't want noise. I didn't want distraction. I wanted to hear my own thoughts clearly for once, even though I wasn't sure they were going to tell me anything comforting. His office looked the same as it had at the will reading. Neutral art on the walls, muted carpet, a tray of water bottles set beside a stack of magazines no one ever touched. But without my siblings there, the room felt different. Less staged, less like a performance everyone had agreed to participate in. Mr. Whitaker greeted me with a polite nod and motioned for me to sit. I set my folder on the desk between us. "I appreciate you seeing me," I said. "Of course." I could hear how formal we both sounded, and part of me wanted to skip past that, to ask the question again in the plainest possible way. Did my father sign something else? But I had spent enough time around people who controlled conversations to know that rushing usually worked in their favor, not mine. So I started with what I could verify. "The documents my brother gave me go further than I was led to believe," I said. "They don't just keep the process moving, they reduce my role." He folded his hands. "They do consolidate decision-making in some areas." That wasn't how they were presented. "No," he said quietly. "I don't believe it was." That answer landed harder than I expected. Because it wasn't just confirmation that Daniel had been shaping the process to his advantage. It was confirmation that someone outside the family could see it too. I pulled in a slow breath. "At the reading," I said, "there was language in the will that didn't sound like my father." Mr. Whitaker's expression didn't change much, but he leaned back slightly, as if settling into a truth he had been expecting me to reach on my own. "Your father had concerns near the end," he said. "About what?" "About how his intentions might be carried out." My throat tightened. So he did change something. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." The word was simple, clean, final. And for a second, everything I had been holding in place shifted. Not because it proved I was right, exactly, but because it meant I hadn't imagined the mismatch, the discomfort, the sense that I was being asked to accept a version of events that had been flattened into something more convenient for someone else. "What did he change?" I asked. Mr. Whitaker reached for a file beside him. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, just with the calm precision of someone handling paperwork. He opened it and slid a document partway across the desk. "This is a codicil," he said, "an amendment to the will." I looked at the first page, but for a second I couldn't absorb the words. I saw my father's name, a date, signatures, legal language that suddenly felt louder than the room itself. "When was this signed?" I asked. 17 days before his death." 17 days. I felt something cold move through me. Not fear, not exactly. More like the sensation of walking into a room you thought you knew and realizing the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. "Why wasn't this read with the will?" His answer came carefully. "Because there was a question of whether it superseded certain administrative provisions in the earlier draft, and I was still waiting on one final verification at the time of the reading." That sounds like a long way of saying no one mentioned it. He didn't flinch. "I understand why it feels that way." I looked back down. The codicil was not dramatic. That was the first thing I noticed. It didn't erase everything that had come before. It didn't turn the entire estate upside down. It did something more precise than that. It changed authority. Major decisions regarding the sale, transfer, or long-term management of the house required my written agreement. The discretionary powers my brother had been trying to solidify through additional paperwork were restricted. A small trust my father had set aside for future family expenses would be jointly overseen, but any deadlock would be resolved by me, not Daniel. Not because I got more money, because I got final say. I read that section 3 times. "Why?" I asked, still staring at the page. Mr. Whitaker answered after a pause. "Your father told me he believed you were more likely to proceed carefully." Carefully. I almost laughed, but nothing about the moment was funny. All those years of being the one people relied on when something needed patience, consistency, follow-through. All the years that had seemed to count for so little in family conversations. Suddenly, here it was in legal form. Not praise, not apology, trust. And he had written it down where it couldn't be talked over. I sat there for a long time without speaking. Mr. Whitaker didn't rush me. A strange sadness settled over me then, not just because my father had changed the document, but because he had done it quietly, privately, in a way that protected the decision, but didn't protect me from the shock of learning how necessary it had been. He had seen something. Maybe not all of it, maybe not clearly, but enough to know that leaving things as they were would hand too much power to the wrong person. And he had never said that to me out loud. "Did Daniel know about this?" I asked. "No," Mr. Whitaker said. "Not from me." "Would my father have told him?" "I can't speculate." I nodded, though the answer was already enough. My father hadn't trusted the dynamic. That much was clear. But he also hadn't confronted it directly. He had done what he often did, made a quiet correction instead of a loud one, left a document instead of a conversation. There was relief in that file, but there was grief, too. Grief for how much of our family had always operated through implication and silence. Grief for how often I had translated that silence into something gentler than it really was. Sometimes you don't realize what your role in a family really was until something forces you to step outside of it. The thought came to me so clearly that I wrote it in the margin of my notes before it disappeared. Not because it sounded clever, because it felt true in a way very little else had lately. I asked for a copy of the codicil. Mr. Whitaker hesitated. "Is there a problem with that?" I said. No, he said. I just want to be clear that once this enters the administrative process formally, the dynamic with your siblings may change quickly. I almost told him it already had. Instead, I said, I think it already has. He made the copy. I placed it in my folder, closed the clasp, and stood. But before I left, I asked one more question. If I hadn't called, I said, would anyone have told me? He met my eyes then, really met them. I'm glad you called, he said. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough of one. On the drive home, I kept the folder on the passenger seat beside me. At every stoplight, I glanced at it, not because I thought it would disappear, but because part of me still couldn't believe it existed. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone had 2 missed calls from Daniel. He must have seen something shift. Maybe the attorney had told him I came by. Maybe he just sensed the delay had turned into something more than hesitation. I let the calls go unanswered and walked inside. 10 minutes later, he called again. This time, I picked up. Where have you been? He asked. No hello, no pretense. I had an appointment. With who? With Mr. Whitaker. Silence. Then, why? I set my bag down on the counter. Because I had questions. You could have asked me. That almost made me smile, not from humor, but from the sheer familiarity of it. The assumption that access to information had to pass through him first. I did ask you, I said. You kept telling me everything was routine. It is routine. No, I said, before I could soften it. It isn't. He went quiet. I could feel the conversation narrowing, both of us aware that something had changed, even if neither of us had said exactly what yet. What did he tell you? Daniel asked. There it was. Not, are you okay? Not, what are you concerned about? What did he tell you? I leaned against the counter and looked at the blank wall across from me. He answered my questions, I said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving right now. His voice sharpened. Why are you being like this? I almost answered automatically, almost apologized for the tone, for the tension, for making things harder at a difficult time. But the codicil was sitting in my bag 3 feet away. And for once, I let the silence sit where it belonged. Finally, he said, we're supposed to be handling this together. The sentence might have worked on me a week earlier, maybe even a day earlier. But now I heard what was underneath it. Together, as long as he defined the terms. I'll be in touch, I said, and ended the call. My heart was pounding harder than the conversation justified, which told me it wasn't really about the call. It was about what the call represented. I was stepping out of the role I'd occupied for years, and my body didn't know how to do that calmly yet. That evening, Daniel sent another email. This one was more polished. Given recent delays, it's important that all parties remain aligned and cooperative so the estate can be administered without unnecessary complications. There was that word again, not as description, as pressure. I read the email twice, then set my phone down very carefully. The old version of me would have tried to respond in a way that lowered the temperature, something reasonable, something that kept the peace while quietly protecting my concerns. Instead, I printed the email and clipped it to the codicil. Not for drama, for clarity. Because I was finally starting to understand that what looked like professionalism in my family often depended on me absorbing the discomfort without naming it. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I didn't respond to Daniel's email that night. I printed it, clipped it to the codicil, and left both on the corner of my table where I could see them the next morning. Not because I needed the reminder. I didn't. By then, every part of me was already aware that things had changed. I left them there because I wanted something physical in front of me, something that made it harder to slide back into my old habit of minimizing what I knew. The next day, I called Mr. Whitaker again. "I'd like to move forward formally," I said. He didn't ask what had changed. He probably already understood that once someone reached this point, there usually wasn't much point in circling around it. "All right," he said. "The cleanest way to do that would be a meeting with all interested parties present." Interested parties. It was such a neutral phrase for people who had known one another all their lives. "When?" I asked. "We can do Friday afternoon." Friday was 2 days away. That felt both immediate and strangely far off. Enough time for me to second-guess myself if I let my mind drift in the wrong direction. Enough time for Daniel to call, push, reinterpret, smooth over, or pressure if he sensed what was coming. "Friday works," I said. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the counter. I had expected that making the decision would feel dramatic somehow, clearer, more satisfying. Instead, it felt quiet, like setting down something I had been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten it had weight. Daniel called that afternoon. I let it ring once, then answered. "What's going on?" he asked. No greeting again, no transition. "There's a meeting on Friday at Mr. Whitaker's office," I said. "For what?" "To go over the estate documents. We've already done that." "Not all of them." The silence on the other end was different this time. Not irritation, not impatience. Calculation. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I want everything reviewed together." "You're making this sound more serious than it is." I looked at the papers on my table, the original will, his email, the forms he had wanted me to sign, the codicil. Maybe a week earlier, I would have felt an almost automatic need to ease the tension in his voice, to say something like, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," to leave room for the possibility that no one had meant anything by it. But the room I used to leave for other people had usually been carved out of me. "It is serious," I said. "That's why we're meeting." He exhaled sharply. "So this is about you not wanting to cooperate?" There it was. The word he had learned could be used like a lock. "No," I said. "It's about me understanding what I'm part of before I agree to anything." "You've never handled this kind of thing before." He said it flatly, almost casually, but it landed exactly where he intended it to. Not "you're confused," not "you need help." You're not qualified to have a say. I leaned against the counter and let the sting of it settle instead of reacting to it. "You're right," I said. "I haven't handled it alone before." "That's not what I meant." "I know." Another silence. Then he said more tightly, "I don't know what Whitaker told you, but if you're turning this into some kind of challenge, it's not going to help anyone." I thought about answering that, about asking why clarity always became conflict the minute it didn't serve him, about asking why every question I asked had to be reframed as disloyalty. Instead, I said, "Friday at 2. Then I ended the call. That evening, my younger sister texted me. "Daniel says there's another meeting. Is something wrong?" I stared at the message for a long time before answering. "Yes," I wrote back. "There are things we need clarified." She responded almost immediately. "Can't this wait until everything settles down?" I read that twice because in our family that phrase had always meant something very specific. Can't this wait until you're ready to drop it? I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. Finally, I wrote, "It's been unsettled for a long time. We just didn't say that out loud." She didn't answer. Friday came with the kind of gray weather that made the whole day feel suspended. Not stormy, not dramatic, just heavy enough that everything outside looked muted. I got to Mr. Whitaker's office 10 minutes early. The receptionist offered me water. I said no, then changed my mind and said yes. My hands were steadier when I had something to do with them. Daniel arrived next, right on time, carrying a leather folder and wearing the same expression he always wore when he believed he was the most prepared person in the room. My younger sister came in a minute later, slightly flushed, as if she had rushed there from somewhere else she would rather have been. No one said much while we waited. Daniel nodded at me but didn't sit beside me. He took the chair across from mine and placed his folder on the table in front of him like he was setting out evidence of competence. My sister sat between us, though angled slightly more toward him than me. Then Mr. Whitaker came in with a file in his hand and closed the door. "Thank you all for coming," he said. The meeting began the way these things usually do, with a summary that sounded procedural enough to make you forget what was underneath it. He reviewed the estate structure, the timeline, the need for signed documents before certain steps could move forward. Daniel relaxed visibly during that part.
I could see it in the way he leaned back, the way his fingers loosened on the folder. It was familiar territory. Administrative, orderly, a version of events where he knew how to lead. Then Mr. Whitaker set one additional document on the table. "I also need to address a codicil executed by your father 17 days before his death," he said. No one moved at first. It was one of those moments when the silence arrives before the understanding does. Daniel's eyes shifted to the paper, then to Mr. Whitaker, then to me. "A what?" my sister asked. "A codicil," Mr. Whitaker repeated. "An amendment to the will." I didn't look at Daniel yet. I kept my eyes on the document, on the clean legal language that had already done more for me than years of trying to explain myself ever had. Mr. Whitaker continued, calm and precise. He explained that the codicil revised certain administrative powers granted under the prior draft. He explained that long-term decisions involving the house could not be finalized without my written agreement. He explained that discretionary authority over specific estate distributions had been narrowed. He explained that, in the event of unresolved disagreement over the family expense trust, the deciding authority rested with me. No one interrupted him. The room stayed so still that I could hear the faint hum of the air vent over the door. Daniel was the first to speak. Why wasn't this brought up at the reading? His voice was controlled, but only just. "As I explained," Mr. Whitaker said, "final verification regarding interaction between the earlier draft and the codicil was still pending at that time." Daniel didn't blink. "And now it's not." "No." He turned to me then. "You knew about this." It wasn't really a question. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" "A few days." His jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to say anything?" I might have answered differently once, defensively, apologetically, as if I had done something socially improper by waiting until information could be presented in the correct setting, instead of handing it to him privately, where he could shape the conversation around it. But I understood that dynamic now. So I said, "I wanted it addressed formally." My sister looked between us. "Wait," she said. "So what does this actually mean?" Mr. Whitaker answered before Daniel could. "It means the estate cannot be administered solely at one person's discretion."
Certain actions require Ms. Harper's approval, and any documents inconsistent with that authority will need to be revised.
Revised. It was such a clean word for what I could feel happening in the room. Daniel sat back slowly. To anyone who didn't know him, he might have looked calm, maybe even thoughtful. But I knew that stillness. It was the kind he went into when something had slipped beyond his control, and he was trying to calculate whether force, charm, or patience would bring it back.
"This is ridiculous,"
he said finally. Not loudly, not explosively, just with a kind of flat disbelief.
"Dad put me in charge because I'm the one who can actually manage this."
"No," I said. The word came out before I had time to decorate it. He looked at me, and for the first time in that room, I didn't feel the need to soften what I meant. "He gave you a larger share," I said. "That's true. But he didn't give you sole control." Daniel's expression hardened. "You think this means he trusted you more?" The question was meant to pull me into something emotional and personal, something easier to dismiss later. I didn't take the bait. "I think it means he wanted checks in place," I said. "And I think that matters." My sister let out a slow breath and looked down at the table. Daniel turned back to Mr. Whitaker.
"So what happens now?" "Now," Mr. Whitaker said, "the administrative documents need to reflect the authority structure in the codicil.
Any forms presented previously that exceeded that structure should not be executed as written." Daniel's folder was still open in front of him. I recognized the top pages immediately. The same forms he had told me were routine, the same ones he had wanted me to sign without review. He closed the folder without looking at it. That small movement did more than any raised voice could have. It acknowledged everything without admitting it. And that was the moment I felt it. Not triumph, not vindication, just a shift, a real one. For the first time, the system in the room did not depend on me staying quiet. It had been moved out of private conversation and into recorded fact, out of family interpretation and into legal structure. Daniel could dislike it. He could resent it. He could tell himself whatever story he wanted about why it had happened, but he could not talk over it. This changed everything. The meeting continued for another half hour, but the tone never recovered its earlier shape. There was no longer any assumption that Daniel would summarize and everyone else would follow. Every next step had to be stated with precision. Every document had to be identified. Every decision path had to acknowledge where my approval was required. I asked questions when I had them, not many, just enough to establish something simple and new, that I was not there to observe. My sister asked fewer questions than either of us, but I could see her adjusting in real time. Not taking sides exactly, just recalibrating. The room had taught her what the family rarely did, that authority could change, and when it did, people changed with it. When the meeting ended, Mr. Whitaker gathered the documents and said updated forms would be circulated the following week. Daniel stood first. He didn't slam his chair back or make a scene. He picked up his folder, thanked Mr. Whitaker in a clipped, formal way, and walked to the door. My sister followed more slowly. I took a second to put my notes away. When I stepped into the hallway, Daniel was waiting. Not dramatically, just standing off to the side near the framed certificates, his face composed in that way people get when they've decided anger won't help, but haven't found acceptance either. "Did you plan this?" he asked. I looked at him for a second before answering. "No," I said. "I found out, and then I made sure it was handled properly." He held my gaze. "You could have come to me first." I almost said, "I did come to you first, over and over, in every way I knew how." but I was tired of explaining what he had never really been willing to hear. Instead, I said, "You already had your version of how this was supposed to go." Something in his face shifted at that. Not softness, not remorse, just recognition that I was no longer speaking from the old position. He looked away briefly, then back. "You've always assumed the worst about me," he said. That one surprised me, not because it was true, but because it sounded like he believed it. "I haven't," I said. "If I had, I would have asked a lot more questions a lot sooner." He didn't answer. We stood there for a moment in that quiet hallway, both of us close enough to decades of shared history that neither one of us needed to say all of it. Then he said, "So what now?" It was the first honest question he had asked me since our father died. I thought about that before I answered. "Now we do this correctly," I said, "and we don't pretend I'm just here to sign whatever gets put in front of me." He gave a small nod. Not agreement, exactly. More like acknowledgement of a condition he didn't have the power to reject. "All right," he said. Then he left. My sister walked out with me to the parking lot. For a while, neither of us said anything. Finally, she said, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself. "Daniel made it sound like everything was already settled." "I know." She looked at me, uneasy. "Are you mad at me?" It was such a younger sibling question, not because she was childish, but because she had always survived family conflict by moving around it, not through it. Her instinct was never to examine the structure. It was to find the safest emotional position nearby. I thought about all the moments she'd called or texted on his behalf, all the times she'd repeated words like complicated and cooperative and settle down without really claiming them as her own. "I'm not mad," I said, "but I can't keep acting like none of that mattered." She nodded slowly. "That's fair," she said. And maybe that was the best we could do in that moment. Not closeness, not repair. Just honesty without performance. Over the next 2 weeks, the new paperwork came through. This time, I read every line before responding. No one objected. That was one of the strangest parts. Once the authority structure had been made explicit, the pressure changed shape. It didn't disappear, but it lost its confidence. Daniel still pushed for efficiency, still preferred to move quickly, still sounded irritated whenever a decision required discussion he hadn't planned for. But he no longer treated my questions as interruptions. He treated them as obstacles, maybe, but legitimate ones. And that difference mattered more than I expected. Not because I enjoyed making things harder, because I finally understood that being consulted was not a favor. The house wasn't sold right away. We agreed to postpone that decision for 6 months. The trust was reorganized according to the codicil. Several of the routine forms Daniel had tried to use were withdrawn and replaced. Communication became more formal after that. Emails with clearer wording, fewer assumptions, less room for one person to interpret for everyone else. Colder, in some ways. Cleaner, too. I stopped answering immediately when a message came in. I stopped apologizing for needing time to review things. I stopped translating my own caution into guilt. And once I stopped doing that, I started seeing how much of my old role had depended on anticipating everyone else's comfort before I even considered my own. That was the part I couldn't return to. Not the conflict, not the estate process, the role. The one where I kept things smooth by staying smaller than I was. Months later, when most of the legal work had settled into a rhythm, I went to the house alone one afternoon to collect a few remaining boxes from the hall closet. It was quiet in the way empty family houses always are. Not peaceful, exactly, just stripped of movement. The kind of quiet that shows you how much of a life used to be held by ordinary sounds. I stood in my father's study for a minute before I left. The desk was cleared now, the papers gone, the drawers empty. I thought about that small memory I'd had, the one where he sat at the table, looking over documents, telling me he needed to understand things himself first. At the time, I hadn't understood how much was contained in that sentence. Now I did. Maybe that was the closest he came to telling me what he was trying to do. Not with warmth, not with a long conversation, just in the language he knew how to use. I don't romanticize that now. I don't tell myself the codicil fixed anything between us that had never really been spoken about. It didn't. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a complete act of courage either. But it was real. And sometimes real is more useful than comforting. By the time I locked the house and walked back to my car, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had won anything. What I felt was steadier than that. I knew where I stood. Not because anyone in my family had finally chosen to define me correctly, but because I had stopped accepting definitions that depended on my silence. The inheritance changed the paperwork, yes. It changed who had to sign, who had to be consulted, who could no longer be bypassed. But that wasn't the deepest change. The deepest change was that I finally saw the family pattern clearly enough to step out of it. For years, I thought keeping the peace meant preserving connection. I thought being dependable would eventually lead to being respected. I thought if I waited long enough, if I stayed calm enough, if I made myself useful enough, the shape of things would naturally become more fair. It didn't work that way. Silence had never been neutrality in our family. It had been permission. A way for the loudest version of reality to become the official one. Once I understood that, there was no going back. Daniel and I still speak, but differently now. Carefully. My sister and I are warmer than that, though neither of us pretends we didn't learn how to survive the same household in very different ways. The estate is still a fact we share, but it no longer defines every interaction. And maybe that's the quietest kind of freedom. Not getting the final word, not watching someone else lose, just no longer living inside the role they counted on you to keep playing.